want to welcome you to the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. I'm Professor Sanders Kornman, a member of the faculty here in the School of Public and International Affairs. I want to welcome you for an event dedicated to a timely topic, the rise of the alt-right, and perhaps a broader assessment of the current state of political ideology and action. So let me get right to the introduction of our two distinguished participants. Mark Lilla is Professor of Humanities at Columbia University, who specializes in intellectual history. Among many honors and awards, he has held a Guggenheim Fellowship, was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, and taught in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Many of us are grateful for what we have learned from reading his essays in the New York Review of Books over the years. His most recent books, both relevant to tonight's topic, are The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics, published by Harper in 2017, and The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction, published by New York Review Books in 2016. Tom Main is professor in the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs here at Baruch. He has written and edited books on homeless policy in New York and the American Constitution, and he will be speaking tonight about his newest book, The Rise of the Alt-Right, published by the Brookings Institution Press in 2018. Professor Main will begin with a brief overview of the findings of his research, and then Professor Lilla will engage in a 20-minute discussion/interview on their thoughts of the state of American democracy and other themes that arise from the book. If you have questions for either Professor Main or Lilla, please write them neatly on an index card index cards will be circulated shortly. The cards will be collected for a question and answer session that will conclude the event. So let me turn it over to Tom Main to start us off.
Okay, now you know that the liberal democracies of the world are going through a crisis because I've said it 3 times, right? You could look at Donald Trump, we can look at Brexit, we can look at other worrisome developments. And the aspect of that crisis or that problem that I chose to look at was the American alt-right, okay, which is maybe the most, Donald Trump is perhaps the most striking example of the democratic recession in American politics, but speaking intellectually, I guess it's the alt-right. So what exactly is the alt-right? The alt-right is not your grandfather's Republican Party. It's not about tax cuts. It's not about, gee whiz, maybe affirmative action isn't a good idea. The alt-right is it's an ideology, right? Rather than a voting bloc, and it is an extremely radical ideology. It is a root and branch rejection of the basic principles of liberal democracy. That is to say, contested elections, the rule of law, human rights, and tolerance, political culture of tolerance. So, and that wouldn't be hard to document, and there are plenty of quotes that I give in my book that say things like, we're too far gone now, we need the rule of a fascist dictator to shut things down. It's easy to quote alt-right thought leaders as they consider themselves about how, and I guess this is the essence of their ideology, all people, all men are not created equal. It's easy to demonstrate, at least superficially, their radicalism. But then the question is, well, maybe these people are kooks, they're like flat earthers. Why even talk about them? Why? Because there's so few of them. So the thing that I did was I decided, okay, let's make an estimate of how large this movement is. How do you get an estimate of the movement? Well, the only hard numbers I could come up with were visits to alt-right web magazines. The alt-right does have web magazines. They have quite a few web magazines. So what I decided to try to get a picture of how large the movement was is I defined what an alt-right magazine was. I defined it narrowly, just looked at a few, no more than 10. And then I compared their visits to their websites to visits to conventional conservative websites, liberal websites, centrist websites, and so forth. And you've been given a handout that shows the result of those, the analysis of those visitors. The alt-right, all their websites put together over the period of time I looked at it, from September 2016 to February 2018, all their sites put together, you got about 4.4 million visits on average a month. Is that a lot? No, it's not a lot if you compare it to the number of visits all conventional conservative magazines got, all liberal magazines got. For instance, conventional conservative sites got like 165 million visits a month. So the alt-right looks very tiny. But if you compare the alt-right, individual alt-right magazines to conventional magazines like the Weekly Standard, like Commentary and so forth, well-known conventional conservative, conventional liberal magazines, the alt-right is doing quite well and is pulling in almost as many visits as these conventional magazines do. So what does that mean? It means the alt-right they're not taking over American political culture, but they have established a toehold that's important because their strategy is what they call a metapolitical strategy. It is to generate ideas, generate an ideology that trickles into the mainstream, that gets into the mainstream by osmosis. And so you don't need a voting bloc of millions of people to do that. You need a relatively small elite group that churns out ideas and facts and factoids to be used by other people, and the alt-right has succeeded in doing that. So, so the point is, how large is the alt-right? Large enough, to do some mischief. And where did they come from? Well, there had always been a right-wing, a far right-wing, a right-wing extremist movement that was exiled from the mainstream by Bill Buckley. All the anti-Semites, the Ayn Randians, well, maybe not all, but a lot of the kooks got exiled from the National Review. And they hung on by their fingertips and got nowhere until the turn of the millennium. So what happened? One series of shocks hits the American political system, beginning with 9/11 and the fiscal crisis and the wars in Afghanistan and changing demographics and so forth, right? So these shocks hit the American political system, and they get people thinking, hey, wait, maybe things are not working so well. Maybe the current wisdom is not current anymore. Maybe we need new ideas. So that was number one. And the other thing that happened was the internet. All of a sudden, all the people who had been exiled because they couldn't get published in the National Review didn't need the National Review anymore. They didn't need any a hard copy journal because it was cheap and easy to go online. And so the result was these extreme right-wingers who had never gone away finally got their crack at the mainstream and, and did their best to enter the mainstream. Was that good? No, it wasn't, right? Because besides their radicalism, the quality of the thought is not very high. We can address that in more detail. So the questions that I'm trying to wrestle with now are what to do about this, right? How can we make the American political system more effective at dealing with the problems that many of the outsider groups, like some of Trump's supporters claim to be? How can we make the American political system more effective at dealing with their problems so they feel less alienated? And how can we revive intellectual culture in the United States, which has been completely debased by the polarization and of ideological discussion, by the retreat of intellectual elites into monadic views of the world that don't intercommunicate? And then how can we regulate the internet to keep the nasty stuff off, or at least regulated? So that's the next book I'm writing. You should buy that one too when it comes out. And now Mark can take it away.
Well, As you know, Tom, I was especially excited about your research when we first talked about it some years ago, and you had the idea of actually trying to churn up some data,
Yeah.
right, on this. So I think that's one of the real contributions of the book. The other thing that I think is a real contribution is that it's very easy when talking about the alt-right, or talking about the right at all, especially right now, to immediately reduce everything to fascism, about which the people who use the term seem to know absolutely nothing. And even if there are parallels, what's important to recognize is there was an intellectual culture behind fascism, right? And so by saying it's like fascism is to say nothing intellectually. Rather, you have to get at what you call the deep structure of alt-right thinking. So maybe you can say a couple words about what you mean by deep structure and how you would just summarize it in a quick way.
Well, I guess what I would say, talk about deep structure. Let's see. Another term I use is philosophy as opposed to an ideology, okay? So if we look at conventional democratic ideologies, you have conservatives and liberals, and you have all sorts of varieties in between, right? And you have socialists and so forth, okay? But they're all buying into a philosophy of democratic liberalism. They're all buying, although they don't always use that term, they're all buying into the idea that, you know, electoral democracy, the rule of law, human rights, etc. Okay, so that's kind of the deep structure. And so the mainstream of American and democratic politics is not like a central point. It's like a band. Okay, anybody who is on that band, well, and they're not necessarily any good, but you can have a debate, you know, and you can say conservatives are destructive or extreme liberals are destructive. You might be right, but they're at least on that philosophy. They share the deep structure. Okay, the key problem emerges when a group steps forward and says, you know what? No, we're not buying into the deep structure. We're not buying into the liberal democratic philosophy. We're going somewhere else. And that's what the alt-right does. And they pull their political philosophy from a lot of sources, some of which are fascist, right? They seem to be particularly interested in Italian fascism, right? They're usually too smart to say, hey, we're into Nazism, okay? So that's one source. Another source is the American Paleo conservatives. I mean, there was a very interesting development in what used to be called right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremism in the late 50s and the early 60s, okay, was like the John Birch Society, right? So the John Birch Society was stupid, right? They said ridiculous things like Eisenhower is a communist. They had no education whatsoever, okay? But the other thing that's interesting is even the John Birch Society would give lip service to, our Constitution and the rights of all peoples, and they would even give lip service to the rights of non-white people, which of course they were lying about and they weren't sincere about, and they spread lies about the civil rights movement and such. But even the far-right extremists back then were still not quite off the liberal democratic band, or at least they didn't dare to say they were. Over time, these exiles from mainstream conservatism got better educated, it seems, and a number of them actually began not very successful academic careers and had PhDs. And they got more radical, and these were the so-called Paleo conservatives that Mark and I would bump into occasionally in the 1980s. And so there you see an attempt to develop an intellectual case for alternatives to liberal democracy. And the man who was the biggest behind that has now passed away, is Sam Francis, who was a journalist for the Washington Times, which was established by the Moonies. He wrote there for a while until they finally kicked him out because he was too radical. But he came up with this magnum opus that wasn't published until after his death, where, once again, his explicit rejection of liberal democracy. He calls it soft managerialism. We won't go into it. But you get an explicit celebration of hard dictatorships like the old Soviet Union and like the fascist powers. So, and there were other people who developed this deep structure, this philosophy. Paul Gottfried was another paleoconservative who did that. There was Kevin MacDonald, who developed a new form of anti-Semitism. So anyhow, the key thing about the alt-right is that wasn't the alt-right yet. But that thought, paleoconservative, anti-democratic thought, had all been well expressed by the mid-1990s. It wasn't until you had the collapse of communism and also the rise of the internet that all of a sudden the people who had been following these paleoconservative reactionaries finally were able to get their stuff out to the masses. And that's when this deep structure started penetrating liberal democracy.
Yeah, and that's a very good summary of the book. But I think you sell yourself a little short. You've also exposed by structure, I mean, deep themes and metaphors. So organicism, anti-individualism, so that you begin with the organic nation or the organic race as the unit of political analysis, really. The second is apocalypticism, the idea that you want to bring the whole structure down. There's no notion of amelioration, but you want a conflagration. You want a fire. That's what Bannon has said. And then and what's supposed to come afterwards is Caesarism. And Caesarism is an old concept, obviously from the actually 19th century, applied to Napoleon and on. The idea that you would have a kind of salvific, military nationalist figure who would lead into the future. And we're seeing the revival of Caesarism, not only in this country, but throughout Europe. The other thing that I really enjoyed in the book was your emphasis on metapolitics. And I'm not sure if people know sort of what that is, what the implications are, but I'll add something to your story, which is that this past summer I spent a lot of time sort of studying people on the right in Europe, especially young people. And the most popular thinker right now, if you meet, I was in France, you meet young people, French people on the right, they can't get through a conversation without mentioning Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, if you don't know, is one of the founders of the Communist Party. He was imprisoned by Mussolini and died in prison. While in prison, wrote these incredible notebooks. And he developed this idea of cultural hegemony, the idea that you're never going to turn Catholics into communists unless you change the culture in which they live. And so the first thing to do is to kind of march through the cultural institutions. And so I was curious if you had some thoughts about that kind of hegemonic activity.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I mean, the term, I think you're right. You talk about organicism. I think that for the alt-right, I use a slightly different metaphor, although it doesn't come up in the book. The basic unit of politics for the alt-right and for other radical right-wing movements is a people, usually defined racially or ethnically, and they live inside a monad of thought, right? They have a collection of values and ideas, right? And a conception of right and wrong and true and false that is entirely based on a subjective worldview or an intersubjective worldview. Everybody of the same race shares it, right? And so what does that mean? That means that people of another race are in another monad and they can barely even understand them, right? So then the question that you come to is, well, what happens when these two monads kind of bump into each other? And you get two responses. One is, well, there has to be a war until one is killed. Or the other response is, oh, we got to keep them as separate as possible because otherwise all hell breaks loose. So, which is the toned down version of it. So yes, organicism, or what I would call this vision of ethnic monads, is important. Then from that comes this apocalyptic vision, because hey, if they look upon liberal democracies as basically completely hegemonic ideologies, as in something almost similar to a monadic vision. So, and they look at the United States, they look at any liberal democracy, and they say, oh, it's this enormous interlocking totalitarian system of interest groups which you can't possibly beat. That's something that they pull from elite theorists of the early 20th century, people like Pareto. Well, here's the question. If liberal democracies are totalitarian systems that you can't beat and you can't get outside of, what are you supposed to do? So the correct answer should be, well, forget about politics, sit back and don't do anything. Well, that's unsatisfying. So therefore, there has to be an apocalypse that blows reality completely out of the charts, levels the whole playing field, and that's the only way you can break out of these monadic systems, of these hegemonic systems of thought. And Sam Francis is quite explicit about that, and a French New Right thinker that I've recently become aware of, Fay, who is the author of a book on archaeofuturism. But he has this vision too. It's very explicit. Oh yeah, there's going to be catastrophe. That's the only way out. And then the interesting thing is, there's going to be a catastrophe, and the catastrophe is going to, what will follow is a dictatorship along the lines of Stalinism or fascism. And that's the rosy scenario. That's good. Catastrophe followed by Stalinism. That's what they're looking for. The bad thing they're worried about is, what happens if liberal democracy just goes on forever and we remain on the outside? That's their nightmare.
Yeah, I'll just mention, that there are parallels to this in the history of the left as well. I mean, obviously, this idea of hegemony and class consciousness, that if you were of another class, you simply could not understand. Well, no, except the proletariat understood everything, or at least the avant-garde did. But the class interests and class understanding of the workers and the owners were completely different. And you see this, apocalypticism certainly in the 70s on the left here and in Europe with terrorism. And also this idea that we can't understand each other. You see that in identity politics today with the idea that white men have one epistemology, black women have another epistemology, therefore we have nothing to say to each other, and certainly you cannot speak for what I understand, and they never say, and I can't speak for you. I mean, often they say, and I can speak for you, but you can't talk about me. But it's the same idea that we are monads, right? Let me just push it further for you, though. Part of hegemony, though, is not only ideas, but it's also a kind of culture and a creation of possibilities. There was this conservative idea that floated for years that was called the Overton window. There's a guy named Overton who was running a conservative think tank. And he said, imagine a window, and you've got a tree in the middle of, you can see through the window. Now, if you leave the window there, it looks like that's in the middle of the picture. But if you don't like that tree, what you can do is move the window so it looks like it's way on the left or way on the right. And what you try to do with hegemony as well is move the window. And partially you can do that through words. And in the elevator, you were talking about how some of these words are creeping in.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. And let's see. I have a slightly different take on identity politics, okay? I think that a lot of what passes for identity politics is in fact just a new version of good old-fashioned interest group politics. So I think things like Black Lives Matter, Si se puede, the future is female, what these are really is new interest groups. Well, they're not exactly new, are they? They're like blacks and women, and they've been around for a long time. But they're becoming politically aware. They mobilize politically. They become new political factions, and they just join into the blooming, buzzing confusion of factions and interest groups that make up American politics. So that's relatively unproblematic. Okay, what is extremely problematic, what is pernicious, is the radical identitarianism of the alt-right. Right, which is monadic, which sees peoples as sealed in these bubbles of subjective thought, or which could be rooted in, very often on the alt-right, it's rooted in race, but in left-wing versions like Gramsci is something kind of like this. It can be rooted in class consciousness and ideas and so forth. So I think the real problem is not so much identity politics, because there's a garden variety of identity politics which is potentially positive and not necessarily anything to worry about, which is not to say that all feminist groups, all black groups, all Hispanic groups, et cetera, that they're right about everything. It's just that they're just another set of interest groups with their own points to make. So that's not problematic. And what's problematic about identitarian politics is this, what I call this radical perspectivism. That's the real problem, right? So it's just that when you join the radical perspectivism, the idea that only I or only my group, right, can really understand things, or we have a completely different understanding, that's what's problematic. And then when you join it, when you say that the group that I'm talking about is my sex, my gender, my race, my ethnicity, well, that gives it some, like a popular base, and it gives it some kind of a cachet. But I think the real problem is this idea of radical perspectivism, the sense that there's no objective truth, there's no morality, there's no sense of rights that overarches all these different people. That's the real problem, rather than glomming on to your ethnicity or your sex and making that a big deal.
Can you just say a word about how the words are moving from?
Yeah. Well, if you look at some of the alt-right talking points are definitely getting picked up in the mainstream. So, for instance, Laura Ingraham, who's on Fox News, right? Ingram? Okay. She's goes around saying, oh, you have to vote Democrat. You have to vote Republican because if the Democrats are elected, the immigrants will come and replace you. That phrase, replacement, which is, by the way, ridiculous. You replace a light bulb. You unscrew it, throw it away, put in a new light. Nobody's talking about anything like that. But anyhow, that was an alt-right talking point. That was an alt-right phrase, replacement. That got in. Race realism, the idea that, hey, race isn't a social construct at all. There's a genetic reality to it. That's starting to catch on, the attack on diversity. Also, the other thing I think that's catching on, and you definitely see it coming into the mainstream conservative rhetoric, is politics is war, right? Which is completely different than saying war is politics. Right, so and that is catching on. That's becoming a standard talking point in even in National Review. You see articles like that, and that is, of course, absolutely pernicious because it implies, hey, anything goes in politics, and if of course, it might be that I'm not going to shoot you right now because that'd be counterproductive, given the. However, if if push comes to shove, yeah, we're out to eliminate you. So these thoughts, radical perspectivism, politics is war. Replacement, the reality, deep reality. Of course, race is a reality. Of course, ethnicity is a reality. But making it kind of like an ontological reality that you can base your whole way of thinking about. Now, I see all of that. Those are like deep ideas that, in fact, are catching on, moving from the alt-right into the mainstream.
Charlottesville was sort of the moment when, for people who hadn't been paying attention, the power and the perniciousness of the alt-right became apparent to a wider American public, right? And it's continued to grow in importance in Europe. How do you see things here since Charlottesville? Sort of what, do they still have the same energy? Do they still have the same audience? Is it outside or inside the Republican Party?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First thing I would say is, there's been a lot of talk about how after Charlottesville, the alt-right peaked and it's fading away. Well, let's hope so, right? I think maybe the brand of the alt-right may be in decline, but I think this deep structure that the far right has been pushing, the deep philosophical rejection of a liberal democracy kind of lives on in various ways. So I think what happened in Charlottesville was, the alt-right, the reason why they got as far as they got, I'm not saying they took over the world, but they definitely traveled a long distance from the John Birch Society to the alt-right. And one crucial thing there was the rise of the internet. There are no gatekeepers, there are no censors on the internet, and it's cheap. So you can say any crazy thing you want to, and nobody can stop you from saying it. And also, in one way, you can publicize what you have to say, but you don't have to go out in public. It's like, it's like going to a porn site. Your mother doesn't have to know about it because you can do it on the web, right? So anyhow, as long as they stuck with the internet as their main mechanism of disseminating their ideas, they were doing pretty well. Then I think what happened is somewhere, some cabal said, hey, now it's time to go into the real world, right? And let's have a demonstration in Charlottesville. And I believe Richard Spencer, who was one of the alt-right progenitors, tried to go on a college speaking tour. That was a big mistake for two. One is, of course, you go into the real world. Now all of a sudden people can stop you, right? There can be counter-protesters, there are police officers, there are regulations. The other thing is, these folks don't need the real world. They're about meta-politics, that is to say, they're about propagating an ideology. Listen, Mark and I used to work for the Public Interest, which was, what was known as a neoconservative publication. The neoconservatives would think whatever you want about them, but there was a period of time where they got a certain amount of traction, their ideas got out, they were picked up. Neoconservatives didn't do that by holding torchlit parades in Central Park, okay? It was, and of course there was no internet, so there were the little magazines, right? So, but the point is this: if you are an ideological or meta-political movement that is trying to develop a set of ideas that will influence how other people speak, right? It doesn't really make much of a difference if you can't hold demonstrations or if, counter-demonstrators show up. They would have been better off if they had simply stayed on the internet. And by the way, we really don't know what has happened to the internet audience of the alt-right, and we don't know what has been going on with, we can move beyond talking about the alt-right, which is a relatively narrow brand that may in fact be in decline. But what is happening are anti-liberal democratic ideologies, do they continue to command an audience on the web, and is the ideas that are propagated digitally, are they being picked up? There isn't any reason to think that that has slowed down since Charlottesville. So I think the alt-right may, narrowly construed, may be on the decline, but whether this larger challenge to democracy has peaked is not clear.
One thing that's happening in Europe is that it's becoming more intellectually coherent. So there are intellectual networks there, from Russia to Hungary, Catholics in Poland, the old right in France, and also in Italy. Those are the countries I know something about. But they are actually sharing speeches, text that becomes central and all the rest. And if you want a little taste of that, you can go on the website of the Hungarian government and look for the site of Viktor Orban, who is the president. And you can get his speeches, which they translate into almost any language. I don't know if have you ever read any of these? Yeah. And they are really rather impressive theoretical pieces, right? And there have been attempts to come up with statements. There's something called the Statement of Paris that had sort of mainstream conservatives like Roger Scruton in Britain to alt-right people in Europe come up with a list of principles, you know? And so there's a kind of deeper intellectual work going on there. And a lot of stuff that shows up in the States comes from there. So the idea of the Great Replacement comes from, there's a man named Renaud Camus, having nothing to do with Albert Camus, who wrote a book called The Great Replacement, and he is one of the inspirers of the alt-right there. There's also a novel called The Camp of the Saints, which is a dystopian novel about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from what was then called the Third World spontaneously getting on boats and heading for the Mediterranean. And they're going to march up from the Mediterranean up to take over Europe. And it's this book that keeps being referred to every time there's a caravan coming from Latin America, right? So one way of trying to understand what's going on here is actually to look at Europe and see how down the food chain it's showing up here. But I guess we're supposed to stop now.
I was wondering if you would mind talking a little bit about, more specifically, I know this is something I've asked you about before, but talking a little bit about Breitbart and Bannon and his influence here, and sort of how does that, is it possible that the far more extreme alt-right has created space for what you're calling the alt-light and made it more mainstream?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Bannon and, well, of course, he's gone from Breitbart now. But when I was writing the book, he was at Breitbart. Bannon, Breitbart, and Donald Trump can be considered part of the alt-light. So what's the alt-light? The alt-light is, well, the alt-right boldly steps forward and trashes liberal democracy and says, oh, people are not created equal, race is real, and as a matter of fact, white people are better, and says all that sort of stuff. Okay, so now they have managed to get an audience, but there's a natural kind of limitation to that. So in Breitbart, you have an attempt to pump the brakes, to occasionally say, oh, yes, of course, all people are created equal, but we mean that in a very, very narrow sense. And by the way, do you know how terrible black crime is? And have you heard the latest crazy thing that this lesbian scholar said, and so forth? So in Breitbart, you have what I call an alt-light. The idea is to say outrageous things that attract attention. They're very similar. I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. It's similar to that, except Breitbart is smart enough, or they used to be smart enough, not to say explicitly "to hell with democracy." Right? So, but the code words pop up. And who, by the way, what is the other great source of alt-light, capital L, thought? Answer, Donald Trump's Oval Office. Right? Donald Trump used to go around saying, all people are not created equal. And then when he became president, he took that all back. Nobody believes that. And nowadays, you saw recently, he goes around, he says explicitly that he's a nationalist. And then which is not necessarily problematic, except it turns out when he says, oh, if you're a globalist, you care about what happens to other people in the rest of the globe, right? Whereas nationalists only care about what happens to our part of the globe. Well, of course, a president has a fiduciary responsibility to deal with our people. Right, we understand that. But to boldly step forward and say, I just don't care about the rest of the world is, quite radical thought. And it can be understood as kind of a softened, gentler version of this kind of radical identitarianism, this radical perspectivism that says, hey, the only thing that counts is us because the world is our dream and we don't care about anybody else. Did you want to say something? No. Here you go.
So here's an interesting question that I might add a little bit on. The question is, if not Trump, would there be another, quote, Trump? I guess the point is, another way of putting this is how much of this is just what we've seen, the direction that politics has turned, sort of a aberration based on a television star who actually lost the popular vote, et cetera? Or is this really symptomatic of where our country is, more deeply?
Oh, it's symptomatic of where our country is more deeply. But, whenever you have a structure, whenever the stars align, whenever you get syzygy and all the planets lined up, the right or the wrong characters have a habit of emerging. And that happened spectacularly in Germany and in Italy in the 30s. And it's happened here. I think that Trump, he's no great mind. He was a personality that he found the right moment. There was a meeting of man and moment. However, if Trump were eliminated, I think we would still be facing the kind of structural problems we're facing. And maybe we would have gotten somebody who was a little smarter, but the leaders, the fascist leaders, were not terribly smart either. So I think this is not simply a problem that we got a dumb person in the White House. The threat to democracy is structural and deep structural.
The way I would describe it is slightly different, which is that one metaphor for thinking about the relation between political ideology and political reality, think of a medicine chest. And let's say that, in your life you get sick or a body gets sick. Depending on what's in the medicine cabinet, people are going to reach for different things, right? No one today, reaches for Marx and the utopian socialists of the 19th century. That's no longer on the medicine shelf, right? And so what's important to watch, you always can expect that there are going to be certain figures who come along, there are going to be certain crises, but you need to pay attention to what has entered and what has disappeared from the medicine cabinet. And Trump can be, I think, a diversion from seeing what Ham just talked about, which are deeper things that are going on ideologically. There is now a new bottle. And whether it would have been Trump or someone else, maybe it'll just have, little doses that'll come in lots of people, right? But it's more important to pay attention, I think, to these deep structural things that Tom's book is about, rather than just on Trump and his progeny.
So since we're in a school of public and international affairs, people, of course, want to know the policy type implications. How do you combat an ideology that is by definition built on irrationality and hypocrisy?
Well, it's odd, right? Because the alt-right glorifies, blood consciousness. The alt-right glorifies racial reality and all the rest of it. And then they write books and create blogs to explain why racial reality and why blood consciousness is more important than ideas. So I, even people who are anti-intellectual intellectuals, deploy intellectual arguments. And I think it's a mistake to say things like, oh, don't bother arguing with them. Don't bother pointing out facts. They're not driven by that at all. Well, of course, they're driven by interests and passions and all the rest of it. But I do think that a certain amount of engagement with understanding the sort of people that you're dealing with and the perniciousness of the ideas you're dealing with, I think it's a mistake to, it's almost as if you say, this new medicine, it's so obviously ridiculous, we're never going to have the Food and Drug Administration look at it and decide whether it works or not. Well, if you do that, the result is it ends up in everybody's medicine cabinet. It's better to step out and take a look at this stuff and say, you know what, this doesn't work, here's why it doesn't work, and that will catch on eventually. And so I say, say not the struggle availeth naught, that there's a room for intellectuals to make the case against this new anti-democratic ideology.
So you're betting on rationality?
Let's put it this way. I want rationality on my side. Right? I'm not going to bet I won't bet on our side unless we've got it on our side.
Yeah, I think this also, this phenomenon shows, I mean, I consider myself a moderate liberal, how much, what a stake modern liberalism has in a healthy conservatism. That conservatism that's intellectually healthy, you can think of it as in two ways, and it can depend. It can be a gateway drug. That's one way of thinking it, that moderate conservatism, you end up over there. My way of thinking about it is that if people have certain yearnings and longings and frustrations, and they don't have, there's not a moderate version of dealing with these things on offer, and especially if the people who might occupy that space are being demonized, are not allowed to speak at universities, will not be published, have their language edited, and all the rest, you are feeding the problem when you do this. Universities must have more viewpoint diversity on campus. You need more conservative professors. There are very few, especially administrators. Administrators tend to be far to the left of the faculty. But you need a presence there, so in order to also have some effect on young conservatives, right? But the thinking is completely upside down. It's complete demonization, which just pushes certain people into a corner and become more radical, and other people just get frustrated and vote for Trump.
Okay. This questioner asks whether we have gone so far beyond a cohesive, deep structure that maybe a liberal democracy is not the answer. Not advocating for fascist state in any way, but perhaps there is a good positive alternative to what seems like a failed system to many.
I wouldn't bet on it. I would put my money on liberal democracy. It's been plugging away since the Glorious Revolution, or some form of it, or the roots of it, since 1688. Now, I would say that maybe we need a new set of ideology. I do think one of the things that's good about Marx's book and also about Fukuyama's book on identity politics is this notion that national identity doesn't have to be a completely negative thing. I think that's perhaps the most damage that the alt-right and these far-right groups are doing is discrediting and making the idea of that nations have a unity and a vision behind them. They're casting discredit on that. I think we actually need something like that, especially as we become more diverse. What would that new ideology be? Neo-Americanism? Neo-progressivism? I don't know. But there was a tremendous effort immediately during and after the Second World War to develop this idea of of a progressive Americanism. You know, my wife knows that I'm a fan of comic books, and if you go back to the comic books of the 1960s, you could see public service announcements where Batman would step forward and say, "Kids, be all American. If anybody, you know, says something about somebody who's the wrong color, you tell them that's un-American." And I think some kind of a vision, minus the superheroes, okay? I'm tired of all those movies. But some kind of a vision, a revival of an American, ideology is not quite the right word, a quasi-religious sense of Americanism, call it whatever you may, it could potentially be a positive thing. So maybe I would like to add that to liberal democracy. There's contested elections, the rule of law, human rights, tolerance. There's no alternative.
Also, the question is based on a false premise. And the premise is that there are systems. The word system is a metaphor. That's all it is. It's one way we try to understand social reality. The problem with the idea of a system is it leads you to think, one, that they're created self-consciously, and if they are created self-consciously, they can be changed. But as you look at experiments that have tried to replace liberal democratic life, say, with a new system, they have all collapsed and have done terrible things because they run into basic social reality. And so political life is the encounter of political ideas, political passions, and institutions. And those things can change and they keep morphing. But if you think in terms of systems, you're going to have this temptation that you think you can replace it. There is no escaping the basic realities of our life. There's no system called capitalism that one can just unplug and plug something else in. We have new sorts of economic relations today because of changes in technology and changes in ideas, changes in our sense of ourselves as individuals and so on. These things are going on. But the abstractions, capitalism, socialism, even liberal democracy, have to be treated just as metaphors and not as reality. That's what Marx called reification.
I think we have time for one more question, and while the speakers are answering the question, we'd like to ask you to fill in the questionnaire that's coming around, and then we'll thank our speakers. So the question, slightly modified, is should the Republican Party be held accountable for the alt-right violence that is increasingly growing, and if so, how?
Well, I don't know if you can hold the Republican Party directly responsible for particular incidents like the Proud Boys melee. Although interestingly, that happened because a Republican club in Manhattan invited an alt-right figure to show up. So I don't want to say that anybody is responsible for a particular death or whatever. But I would say that the Republican Party's response to this rise of anti-liberal ideologies has been extremely weak. They played their cards terribly in the election of 2016 and allowed somebody like Trump to come to the top. And so I would say the Republican Party is, to a considerable extent, responsible for the democratic recession that we're now experiencing. But they don't have 100% of the responsibility, and a lot of the responsibility is in deeper cultural and trends. And the Democrats didn't play their cards particularly well either. But I'm not in, I'm kind of. I'm rather more skeptical, Mark, about the possibilities for a respectable conservatism right now, at least. In principle, I like the idea of having a wide-ranging a wide spectrum of political opinion so that everybody has a chance to participate. But to tell you the truth, I'm not sure exactly right now where this responsible conservatism would come from, or who would lead it, or who it would be.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.